My name is Carolyn Walker. I'm 62 years old, a retired school teacher, and a widow for the last 7 years. I live alone now in a modest house filled with memories, most of them shaped by the love I poured into raising my only son, David. A few months ago, I gifted David and his wife Melanie a fully paid home, no mortgage, no debt. I used my life savings, told myself it was a gift of love, a foundation for their growing family. I chose the paint colors, assembled furniture in my garage, even sewed curtains by hand. It wasn't just a house, it was a piece of me. So when I received a message from David that morning, my hands trembled in a way I hadn't felt since the day we buried his father. The screen glowed with a simple sentence. "You won't be joining us on the family cruise. Melanie prefers to keep it just family." Just family, and somehow I wasn't part of that anymore. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the scent of the coffee I hadn't yet touched, reading the words again. My fingers were stiff, cold. I typed a single word back. Okay. That word carried everything: the hurt, the shock, the realization. I pressed send, but inside, a voice was screaming. "So I was good enough to buy your house, but not good enough to sit at your dinner table? Not good enough to ride your cruise ship?" My heart pounded like a drum, but my face stayed still, calm, detached. And in that moment, something inside me cracked. The part that made excuses for others, the part that stayed quiet to keep the peace, that part was gone. The morning light moved slowly across the floor, touching the kitchen chairs I had once refinished by hand, the same chairs David used to sit on with his scraped knees and impossible questions about the stars. That little boy was gone, and in his place stood a man who had quietly drawn a line that I was no longer allowed to cross. The house felt unfamiliar now, like a museum of bad decisions. On the walls hung photos I had paid to take, smiles from family vacations I had fully funded. Disneyland when David was 7. Cancun when Melanie first joined the family. A cozy cabin trip I insisted on paying for that Christmas they said money was tight. I had told myself it was my gift to them, but now all I could see were receipts wrapped in photo frames. I thought back to their housewarming party last spring. The one I planned. The one I paid for. I remembered Melanie taking my hands with a tearful smile. "Carolyn, you didn't have to do this. We're so grateful. You'll always have a room here, you know that." And I believed her. Of course I did. Because mothers believe. It's what we do. I remembered the evenings I spent repainting their master bedroom while they were at work. I chose soft lavender because Melanie said it was calming. I bought new curtains online and installed them myself. Every piece of furniture in that house had my fingerprints on it. Every throw pillow, every lamp, every rug. I kept myself busy so I wouldn't have to face the quiet truth. They didn't call much. They rarely visited. But I told myself they were just busy. That's what young couples do. They work hard, they settle in, they figure it out. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was heavier than paint cans and moving boxes. The truth was that I had made myself so useful to them that they stopped seeing me as a person. I was the fixer, the helper, the wallet. And once the money had been spent, there wasn't much use for the woman attached to it. I had given too much for too long. And in return, I had been quietly erased. The next morning, the silence in the house was unbearable. It wasn't the kind of quiet that soothed. It was the kind that pressed on your chest, made your hands twitch, and reminded you that something was terribly wrong. I picked up the phone and called Nancy. She arrived within the hour. No questions, no hesitation, just like she always had. That's the thing about old friends, they know when to talk and when not to. She stepped into my kitchen, took one look at my face, and didn't need to ask what happened. "Tell me," she said gently, setting her purse down. I slid my phone across the table so she could read the message herself. Her jaw tightened as she read. She didn't speak right away, just shook her head slowly like she had expected this moment to come. "They've been planning this, Carolyn." I shook my head, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. I thought, maybe it was just Melanie. Maybe she got into his head. But David, he's not like this. Nancy looked at me with that mix of love and truth only a lifelong friend can offer. She reached across the table and took my hand in hers. "You raised a good boy," she said. "But you also raised a boy who never had to struggle, who always had you fixing things." Melanie saw that. She saw what she could shape him into. I looked away. "You made yourself small, Carolyn, and now they're treating you like you belong there." Her words hurt, because they were true. I had stayed useful so long, I forgot how to be seen. But something was shifting, and I was finally ready to be seen again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Nancy's words echoing in my mind. They've been planning this. At 2:17 a.m., I got up and walked to the kitchen. The glow from my laptop screen lit the room as I sat down, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. For years, Melanie had handled most of my online accounts. It's just easier, she'd always say with that syrupy voice. You shouldn't worry about these things in retirement. And I had believed her. I wanted to believe she was helping. I wanted to believe I still mattered. But that night, I logged in with a different kind of awareness. So at first glance, everything looked fine. My checking, savings, retirement accounts all intact. Nothing jumped out. But that's how it works, doesn't it? The danger hides behind the ordinary. So I dug deeper. And there they were, multiple transfers, small amounts, spread over time, labeled things like property maintenance, home repair, emergency fund. But I hadn't approved any emergency repairs. I hadn't authorized any linked payments. I clicked further. The destination accounts weren't in my name. They were in Melanie's. She had added herself as a secondary user, quietly, smoothly. She had been skimming from me, bleeding my account slowly, so it wouldn't raise alarms. So this wasn't just a case of thoughtlessness. This was theft, with a smile. And David? Was he blind? Or did he just not care, as long as the money kept flowing? I sat back in my chair, heart racing, not with fear, but with something colder, sharper. A clear realization settled into me like ice. They weren't planning to hurt me later. They were already doing it. And they thought I'd never notice. But I had noticed. And I wasn't going to sit quietly anymore. By morning, I had already made up my mind. No more silence, no more waiting for another betrayal. It was time to move. I called Mr. Harris, my attorney. He'd handled my affairs for years, helped with my will, my retirement planning, even the documents I signed when I transferred the house to David and Melanie. He picked up right away. And Mrs. Walker, good to hear from you. Everything all right? No, I said calmly, and that's why I need to see you today. He cleared his schedule. Within hours, I was sitting across from him in his office, hands folded neatly in my lap. I want to reverse the house transfer, I told him. Lock down every account. Cancel all powers of attorney. Every single one. He paused. Not because he disagreed, but because he understood what that meant. This could cause tension, he said gently. They already caused tension, I replied. I was just too blind to see it. He nodded. Very well, we'll begin the reversal process. But Carolyn, if you suspect financial abuse, we'll need evidence. Detailed records. I have some, I said, and slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. And I want more. He raised an eyebrow. Are you open to hiring a private investigator? I didn't hesitate. Hire whoever you trust. He nodded again. Then we move quickly. I'll begin the filings. And the investigator can start building the paper trail. As I walked out of his office, something in me had shifted. It wasn't just about stopping them anymore. It was about reclaiming myself quietly, methodically, and with the kind of strength they never saw coming. That afternoon, I returned home and sat at the kitchen table, the sun warming my face. For the first time in weeks, my hands didn't shake. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I was still the woman who signed anything placed in front of her with a polite smile. But that woman was gone. And the one who replaced her had no intention of being erased. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my front door. White, plain, familiar. Melanie always used those when she sent over paperwork she'd helped organize for me. On top was a yellow sticky note in her looping handwriting. Just sign whenever you're ready, Mom. It'll make everything easier while we're away. I hadn't heard the front door open, which meant they had probably sent someone else perhaps before leaving for their cruise. They were already gone. Off on sapphire blue waters, sipping cocktails and posing for photographs. Meanwhile, this little envelope waited on my kitchen counter, patient as a trap. I opened it carefully. The documents inside were professionally typed, tidy, precise. On the surface, they looked harmless, routine updates, estate simplifications, household authorizations. But as I read line by line, My stomach turned. Buried deep in the legal jargon was a new power of attorney. Permanent. Tane. Irrevocable. It would grant Melanie complete control not just over my finances, but my property, my medical decisions, even the authority to admit me into care facilities without my consent. They weren't waiting for me to grow old or weak. They were preparing to take everything while I was still alive. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about control. I stared at the papers for a long moment, then slowly placed them back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood still, one hand resting on the counter as I let the weight of it all settle over me. Then I whispered into the quiet kitchen, as though speaking to the woman I used to be. You almost signed this. Almost. But not today. Today, I saw it for what it was. And I would use this document not to surrender but as evidence. Because they thought they were 2 steps ahead. But I had just caught up. And I was already turning the tide. By noon, I was back in Mr. Harris' office. This time, there was no small talk. He saw the look on my face and simply nodded. They tried to slide this under my door while they were on a cruise, I said, handing him the envelope. He opened it slowly, his eyes narrowing as he read the fine print. When he reached the section on irrevocable authority, he exhaled sharply. This isn't just unethical, he said. It's predatory. If I had signed this, I replied, they could have sold my home, drained my accounts, even admitted me to a care facility, all while smiling to my face. He looked at me carefully, waiting for the panic. But there was none. Let's move faster, I said firmly. His expression shifted, respect replacing concern. We already have most of the paperwork prepared, he said. The reversal on the house deed is filed. The asset freeze is underway. The investigator has started a full financial audit. But after seeing this, he tapped the envelope. We'll take more aggressive steps. Lock down every account. No one touches your assets without your signature. I nodded. And one more thing, he added. We're drafting a protective clause. If they attempt any legal coercion, we'll have a full timeline of manipulation ready to present in court. I leaned back in the chair, my breath steady, my shoulders loose. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was building. And I was building something they wouldn't see until it stood between us like a wall. When I returned home that afternoon, the house looked the same, but everything had changed. Because I had changed. The woman who once paid for everything in hopes of being loved had been replaced by someone else. Someone who was done apologizing for surviving. Someone who finally realized that peace doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from protecting your boundaries and knowing your worth. And now I was protecting both. 4 days later, their cruise ship docked. I was already there. I parked a block away and stood quietly across the street, watching as David and Melanie pulled up in their SUV, tan and relaxed, luggage piled high in the trunk. Melanie stepped out first, barking orders about scheduling the mortgage finalization. David trailed behind her, scrolling through his phone, detached as always. And then they both froze. 2 unfamiliar cars were parked in the driveway. A moving van. A young couple stood near the front door, laughing with a realtor. Boxes were being unloaded. It took them a second to realize what they were seeing. David was the first to speak. Mom? His voice wavered, confused, uncertain. Melanie's face tightened. What's going on? Who are these people? I stepped forward, slow and calm. You won't have to manage anything for me anymore, I said. Melanie's tone sharpened. What does that mean? David looked around in panic. Why are there people in our house? It's not your house, I said evenly. Not anymore. Melanie moved toward me, her voice rising. You can't do this. We're refinancing, we have contracts. I reached into my bag and handed David a folder. Here are the only contracts that matter. He opened it with trembling hands, flipping through the pages: house reversal, sale documentation, financial audit, copies of unauthorized transactions. Melanie snatched the folder from him, scanning the documents like a drowning woman searching for a rope. She looked up, eyes blazing. None of this will hold up. We were helping you. You'll regret this. I held her gaze. You mean draining my accounts while smiling in my face? Feeling legal authority behind my back? Listing my home as collateral while I sat in the dark? David whispered, we didn't mean. I raised my hand. No, you didn't mean to get caught. Silence followed, the kind that cuts deeper than yelling ever could. Then, I pulled out a second folder and gave it to Melanie. Inside were full legal records, every forged signature, every financial abuse, every coercive tactic. If you take me to court, I said calmly, this becomes public record. They stood frozen, pale, defeated. I looked at David, my son, and said my final words. I was your mother. You made me your target. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I drove home slowly, the sun dipping low behind the rooftops. My new apartment was modest, no marble counters, no curated furniture, but it was mine. Fully mine. I placed my phone face down on the table, ignoring David's final text, one last plea dressed as regret. I had nothing left to give. And in that emptiness, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. They thought I would fall apart without them. But the truth was, I had been buried under them for far too long. Quiet doesn't mean weak. It means listening. And now I speak only for me.
The Miller house in Portland, Maine, looked like a timeless treasure. Its tall windows reflected the morning light, the brick walls held decades of memories, and the wooden staircase carried the weight of countless footsteps. Caroline Miller, 38 years old, paused for a moment at the kitchen counter, listening to the creak of the hallway floorboards above her. To anyone else, those imperfections were signs of age, but to her they were pieces of a story she had come to cherish. "Mommy, look, the clouds are making animals," 6-year-old Sophie called from the living room window, her small hands pressed against the glass as if she could reach the sky itself. Caroline smiled. Sophie's imagination was like a stream that never stopped flowing. Every morning brought a new adventure, a new picture painted in her mind. Caroline poured orange juice into a glass and called her back to the table. Breakfast at the Miller house looked ordinary, yet something felt slightly off. Daniel Miller, Caroline's husband, came down the stairs with his usual polished appearance. He was 40 tall, handsome, and always careful about how others saw him. With colleagues and neighbors, his charm was magnetic. At home, however, there were moments when his smile did not reach his eyes. "I have an important meeting this weekend," Daniel said as he ruffled Sophie's hair. "If it goes well, it could change everything for us. Daddy will bring you a special gift, I promise." Sophie's eyes lit up with hope. Caroline kept quiet. There was something in Daniel's tone she could not shake. He had been different these past few months, ever since Caroline's mother had passed away and left her a large inheritance. The grief was still raw, yet her husband's restlessness seemed sharper than grief. Evelyn Miller, Caroline's mother-in-law, added another layer of tension. She often called unannounced, reminding Caroline that she would be visiting soon. Evelyn presented herself as gracious and elegant, but Caroline knew the truth. Evelyn saw Caroline as inadequate, never quite worthy of her son. With Sophie, her affection came with conditions, expecting the child to behave more like a miniature adult than a carefree little girl. That morning carried all of these unspoken threads. Caroline tried to focus on Sophie's laughter, but her mind was unsettled. She felt the presence of shadows she could not name. The Miller family seemed picture perfect from the outside, but within its walls, a quiet storm was beginning to gather. The following days carried a rhythm that felt both familiar and uneasy. Caroline busied herself with preparations for an upcoming exhibition at the Portland Art Museum, a project she had dreamed of for years. It focused on forgotten female artists of the 20th century, women whose work had been overlooked or dismissed. Caroline poured her energy into it, telling herself that dedication to art would ground her. Yet in the quiet of the house, shadows lingered. Sophie, with her endless curiosity, often drifted into Caroline's study while she worked. One afternoon, the little girl held up an old photograph she had found in a box of belongings. "Mommy, is this Grandma?" she asked. Caroline looked at the faded picture of herself as a child, standing beside her late mother. Her chest tightened. "Yes, sweetheart. That was Grandma when she was younger." Sophie nodded but then whispered as if protecting a secret. "Grandma talks to me sometimes. She says I should be careful." Caroline tried to laugh it off. Children often blurred dreams with memories, and Sophie's imagination was famously vivid, but the words planted themselves in Caroline's mind, growing heavier with each passing day. The tension deepened when Sophie quietly confessed one evening, "Mommy, I saw Daddy on the phone with Grandma Evelyn." They were whispering. "Daddy said you would not notice." Caroline paused. Daniel did take countless work calls, often in hushed tones. Still, there was something about the seriousness in Sophie's eyes that made Caroline uneasy. She brushed her daughter's hair gently and replied, "Sometimes adults keep secrets for work, but thank you for telling me." Even as she reassured Sophie, a wave of doubt crept into her heart. Late one night, when Daniel claimed he had gone to bed early, Caroline walked past his study. The door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. Inside, files were stacked neatly, but one drawer remained open. Her eyes fell on a folder marked life insurance. Her hands trembled as she scanned the documents. Just 1 week after her mother's funeral, Daniel had taken out a high-value policy in Caroline's name. The beneficiary was Daniel himself. The air felt suddenly heavy, her pulse quickening. She set the documents back as carefully as possible, forcing the drawer shut. Her mind raced. Why now? Why so soon after the inheritance? She tried to rationalize perhaps Daniel was being cautious, providing financial security, but something about the timing felt chilling. The next morning, Sophie lingered by the window again. "Mommy, I dreamed about the basement," she whispered. Caroline froze. The old servant's basement, sealed off decades ago, had only been mentioned once in the property report. She had never spoken of it to Sophie. "What basement?" Caroline asked cautiously. "The one with a secret room. It's for hiding when bad people come," Sophie answered with complete seriousness. Caroline forced a smile, but her chest tightened. Dreams or warnings? The line between the two was becoming dangerously thin. Friday evening arrived with a heaviness that clung to the walls. Daniel had kissed Sophie on the forehead before leaving the house with his suitcase, insisting that his business trip could not wait. Caroline had nodded, though the knot in her stomach grew tighter. After he left, she found herself walking from room to room, touching furniture, opening and closing doors, as if checking whether the house was still truly hers. Later that night, while Sophie colored pictures in the living room, Caroline noticed movement outside the window. A man in a dark coat walked slowly along the edge of the property. He paused near the garage, then circled toward the backyard. Caroline's breath caught. She quickly closed the curtains and pulled Sophie close. "We will stay inside tonight," she said, forcing a smile, but inside, unease spread like cold water. When Sophie went to bed, she begged, "Mommy, can I sleep in your room?" Caroline hesitated, then agreed. The child clung to her stuffed rabbit as if it carried all her courage. Caroline kissed her goodnight, trying to ignore the echo of her daughter's earlier words, "Daddy and Grandma are planning something bad." Sometime past midnight, Caroline stirred awake. A faint chemical smell seeped through the cracks of the window. Her throat prickled. She sat up sharply. Gasoline, heart racing, she crept downstairs to check the doors. When she reached for the back door handle, it refused to turn. Panic rose. She tried the side door, then the front. Every one was locked tight from the outside. A mechanical hum followed, and metal shutters descended over the windows, sealing them in silence. Smoke began to creep beneath the kitchen door. Sophie, awakened by the noise, appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching her rabbit. "Mommy," she whispered, trembling, "we need to escape right now." Caroline's chest tightened. "What do you mean? Where can we go?" Sophie's voice shook but carried conviction. "Behind the pantry. Grandma told me in a dream." The smell of smoke thickened, and faint crackling sounds grew louder. Caroline grabbed her daughter's hand and ran to the pantry. At first glance, it was just a small closet filled with shelves of canned goods and flour jars. Sophie pushed aside the lower shelf and pointed. "Here." Caroline knelt and found a wooden panel. She pulled hard. It creaked open, revealing darkness. "Go, sweetheart," Caroline urged. Sophie crawled inside first, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Caroline followed, pulling the panel closed behind them. The narrow passage smelled of dust and earth, cobwebs brushing against their faces. Caroline's heart pounded as smoke seeped faintly into the tunnel. "Where does this lead?" she whispered. "To the garden shed," Sophie replied calmly. "Grandma showed me." They crouched and crawled through the darkness, guided only by a sliver of light far ahead. Behind them, a loud thud shook the walls, followed by the roar of fire-consuming wood. The heat seemed to chase them forward. Caroline whispered prayers under her breath, forcing her body to keep moving. Sophie never looked back, her small steps sure and determined. At last they reached a rusted door. Caroline shoved it open, and fresh air burst in. They emerged into the cool night inside the shed. Caroline lifted Sophie and stumbled out into the yard. Behind them, flames had already devoured the house. Black smoke twisted into the sky, and the glow of fire painted the neighborhood in a sinister red. Sirens wailed in the distance. Sophie tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, let's go to Miss Barbara's house," she urged, naming the neighbor 2 doors down. Caroline held her close, her eyes filling with tears. "You saved us," she whispered. Sophie looked up, her gaze steady. Grandma was watching. She knew Daddy's plan. Caroline trembled at the words, but she did not argue. Holding Sophie tightly, she ran toward Barbara's porch. When the neighbor opened the door, Caroline and Sophie stood covered in soot, their faces pale with terror. "Please," Caroline gasped, "call the police. Daniel set the house on fire. He tried to kill us." Though almost impossible to believe, Barbara reached for the phone without hesitation. Outside, the blaze swallowed the home that once held their lives. By the time fire trucks arrived, the Miller home was beyond saving. Flames roared through the roof, and the structure groaned under the pressure of collapsing beams. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering in disbelief as firefighters battled the inferno. Caroline sat on Barbara's porch, holding Sophie close, both of them shivering despite the heat of the blaze. Her voice shook as she repeated to the officers what had happened. "This was not an accident. My husband planned this. He wanted us gone." The detective in charge, a gray-haired man named Lieutenant Harris, crouched down to her level. "Ma'am, that is a very serious accusation. Do you have anything that can support it?" Caroline pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling hands. On the screen were photographs she had taken the night before, images of the life insurance policy she had found in Daniel's desk, documents that named him as the sole beneficiary. Harris studied the photos, his expression tightening. "This raises questions, but it may not be enough on its own." At that moment, Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve. With surprising composure, she spoke softly but firmly. "Daddy said if Mommy was gone, everything would be his. He said it on the phone to Grandma Evelyn. And he said it should look like an accident." The officers exchanged glances. Harris looked at Sophie, his tone gentle. "When did you hear that?" 3 days ago, outside Daddy's study," she answered. "He was looking at house plans and told someone the security system was ready." Hours later, investigators confirmed what Caroline and Sophie had described. Residue of gasoline was found around the property, poured deliberately at key points. Even more damning, the security system had been tampered with, allowing the windows and doors to be locked remotely. What had seemed like a frantic claim from a desperate wife was quickly becoming a credible case of attempted murder. Detectives began searching for Daniel. His supposed business trip unraveled immediately. Co-workers at his investment firm testified that no meeting had been scheduled. Within a day, police located him at a gas station along the interstate. In his trunk, they found a large stash of cash, falsified identity papers, and a burner phone. Daniel was arrested on the spot. During interrogation, he shouted, "I'm innocent. This was all my mother's idea. She pushed me into it." When Evelyn Miller was taken in, her polished facade cracked. At first, she insisted she knew nothing, but when confronted with Daniel's accusations, her composure broke. "That ungrateful boy," she spat. "I sacrificed everything for him. I only wanted what was best." As investigators pressed her, the disturbing truth unfolded. Together, mother and son had orchestrated the plan to eliminate Caroline and Sophie, seize Caroline's inheritance, and cover it as a tragic household fire. The financial motive was undeniable. Records showed that Daniel was drowning in debt, his image of success nothing but a performance. He had been funneling money into failed ventures and supporting a mistress in another city. Evelyn, blinded by devotion to her son, believed removing Caroline would free him to start fresh. The discovery sent a chill down Caroline's spine. What she had sensed in Daniel's eyes, what Sophie had overheard in whispers, was now carved into hard evidence. As dawn broke over the smoldering remains of the Miller home, Caroline sat in the back of a patrol car with Sophie in her lap. She stared through the window, still in shock. The place that once held laughter, morning breakfasts, and childhood dreams had been reduced to ashes by the very man who had sworn to protect them. Yet amid the ruin there was one undeniable truth: they had survived. And now the truth about Daniel and Evelyn was finally coming to light. 3 months later, the courthouse in Portland became the stage where every hidden truth was forced into daylight. Caroline sat on the wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly together. Beside her, Sophie swung her legs nervously but kept her chin high. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to hear how a respected businessman and his elegant mother could be accused of such a crime. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. Photographs of the tampered security system. Reports confirming gasoline had been poured strategically throughout the Miller home. phone records showing repeated calls between Daniel and Evelyn during the weeks leading up to the fire. The prosecutor spoke with measured clarity. The defendant, Daniel Miller, intended to murder his wife and daughter in order to claim her inheritance. This was not a crime of passion. This was calculated, deliberate, and cold. Daniel's defense attorney tried to shift the blame. At first, they argued that Daniel's mental state had deteriorated under financial pressure. When that failed to gain sympathy, Daniel turned against his mother. "She manipulated me," he declared from the stand. "Evelyn Miller has always controlled my life. This was her plan, not mine." The courtroom stirred, but Evelyn's reaction silenced the room. Rising to her feet, her voice cracked with fury. "Do not dare put this on me, Daniel. I did everything for you. I carried out your wishes because I thought you deserved better than her." Her confession shocked even her own attorney. But the most unforgettable moment came when Sophie was called to testify. The 6-year-old walked to the witness stand, holding her stuffed rabbit. The bailiff swore her in gently, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Sophie's voice was small but steady. She told the jury how she had overheard her father on the phone with her grandmother. She repeated his words, "If Caroline is gone, everything will be mine. We just need to make it look like an accident." She described the old house plans her father had studied, and how she had found the hidden passage, because her grandmother, Caroline's late mother, had told her in a dream. The prosecutor asked softly, "Sophie, when you say grandma, which one do you mean?" Sophie pointed at Caroline. "Mommy's mommy. She warned me about Daddy's plan." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. It was not evidence in the traditional sense, but it was the kind of truth only a child could carry, clear, fearless, and impossible to ignore. When Sophie stepped down, tears filled Caroline's eyes. She knew her daughter's courage had carried more weight than any document. In the end, the jury returned guilty verdicts for both Daniel and Evelyn. Daniel was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder and arson. Evelyn received 8 years for conspiracy. Justice, though painful, had been served. 6 months later, autumn leaves drifted across the yard of a small cottage on the edge of Portland. The home was modest compared to the Miller family's old estate, but for Caroline and Sophie, it was a sanctuary. Warm light spilled from the windows each evening, and the scent of apple pie often lingered in the kitchen. What mattered was not size or grandeur, but safety and peace. Caroline had returned to her work at the museum, slowly regaining her rhythm. Her new project, a foundation to support young female artists, had taken root. She named it the Second Light Foundation, a tribute to the idea that life could offer another chance to shine after darkness. Part of her inheritance funded it, transforming what had once been a source of tension into a tool for hope. When she explained the name to Sophie, the little girl nodded proudly. "It means we can start again," she said. Sophie had also begun to heal. With the help of Dr. Michael Hayes, a gentle and patient child psychologist, she learned to talk about her fears instead of carrying them in silence. She made friends at school, filled sketchbooks with colorful drawings, and even had one chosen for a student art exhibition. On the paper she had drawn 3 figures: herself, her mother, and her grandmother. Caroline framed it and hung it in the hallway. One evening, as snow threatened at the horizon, Michael joined them for dinner. He had become more than a counselor. He was a steady presence, someone who had quietly stepped into their lives with kindness. After the meal, Sophie leaned against her mother's arm and asked, "Mommy, what is a real family?" Caroline thought for a moment before answering. "It is not about blood alone. It is about people who care for each other, protect each other, and want each other to be free." Sophie smiled, her eyes thoughtful. She glanced at Michael and added, "Then maybe he is family too." The 3 of them shared a quiet laugh, the sound blending with the crackle of the fireplace. For the first time in a long while, Caroline felt the warmth of a true beginning. On Christmas Eve, snowflakes drifted gently past the windows, settling on the quiet street outside. Caroline and Sophie sat together by the fire, the warmth of the flames wrapping around them. The old fears had not vanished completely, but the air now carried a sense of peace rather than dread. Sophie leaned against her mother's shoulder, clutching the same stuffed rabbit that had traveled with her through fire and fear. Caroline kissed the top of her head. "Your courage saved us, Sophie. You gave us a new life." Sophie looked up, her voice soft but certain. "We saved each other, Mommy. And Grandma helped too." Caroline smiled, her eyes glistening. Perhaps her mother's love really had lingered beyond the grave, guiding them through the darkest night. Perhaps it was simply the power of memory. Either way, Caroline believed it had carried them when she had nearly lost all strength. As the fire crackled, Caroline reflected on what had unfolded. She had learned that trust is not blind, and family is not defined by blood alone. True family is found in the people who stand with you in your most fragile moments, who protect rather than betray, who heal rather than harm. It is in a daughter's courage, in a friend's steady hand, in the quiet promise of a safer tomorrow. To everyone listening, hold close those who love you honestly, and do not ignore the quiet instincts that whisper when something feels wrong. They may save your life. If this story touched you, please like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and comment your thoughts below. And do not forget to subscribe to The Art of Revenge for more stories of resilience, betrayal, and the strength to begin again. Your support helps keep these voices alive, reminding us all that even in darkness there can be a second light. I was standing in the break room at my fragrance studio when I opened a lunchbox I thought was mine. The younger staff leaned in, laughing as I pointed to the lid rim dusted with tiny white crystals. One joked it looked like I was about to enjoy a margarita at noon. I chuckled with them, thinking it was just sugar stuck from dessert. But when I carried the container over to Grant, my longtime colleague and a former ER doctor, the mood shifted instantly. His face drained of color. He rubbed the rim under the light and whispered, low and urgent, "Do not taste this. Call your son, get him to the hospital now." The laughter froze. My chest tightened. In that moment, the simple act of opening a lunchbox stopped being a light-hearted mistake. It became the doorway into the most terrifying battle of my life. My name is Marian Cole, and I am 61 years old. I built my fragrance studio in Seattle with nothing but a few essential oils on a kitchen counter and a dream that refused to die. Over the decades, I poured every ounce of effort into growing it into Cole Atelier, a name that now stands proudly on boutique shelves across the coast. My son Tyler is the heart of my story. At 32, he is a managing director at a small investment firm, known for his discipline and his integrity. Watching him succeed is the reward for every sacrifice I made as a single mother. When Tyler married Avery 3 years ago, I opened my arms to her as if she were my own daughter. She was polished, thoughtful, and quick to laugh. Our Sunday dinners felt complete, the family I had always hoped for. That is why this moment matters. Because everything I had built, my business, my family, my life was now tied to that lunchbox. That Monday morning had started like any other. The rain tapped lightly against the kitchen windows as Avery moved with practiced ease between the stove and the counter. She had tied her hair back in a neat bun, balancing a phone between her shoulder and ear while she laughed with a friend about weekend plans. 2 lunchboxes sat open in front of her, one larger container for Tyler, who often worked through long meetings, and a smaller one for me. I watched her ladle soup into each, tuck in rice and vegetables, and close the lids with care. In my family, we had a little system. My box was always marked with a sticker in the corner, but that morning, distracted by her phone call, Avery forgot the detail. I picked up the larger container without even noticing. It seemed harmless, almost funny, the kind of absent-minded mistake we all make in busy kitchens. Yet that small exchange, that simple oversight, became the thread that unraveled everything we thought we knew about love and loyalty. By noon, the fragrance studio was buzzing with the usual Monday chatter. The younger staff circled the break room table, swapping stories about spilled coffee, weekend dates, and their toddler's mischief. I slipped into the room, set my tote down, and opened the container I thought Avery had packed for me. The lid came off with a faint snap, and there it was again, those white flecks clinging to the rim. One of the assistants laughed. "Ms. Cole, that looks like a cocktail glass at a beach bar." Another chimed in, "Avery must think you need a sweet treat to get through the day." The room erupted in giggles. I played along, lifting the box for everyone to see. "She probably wants me to put on a little weight," I joked, but my smile faltered as I noticed the unusual sparkle. I carried the container to Grant, who had stepped in to refill his coffee. His hands, once so steady in emergency rooms, stilled as he studied the crystals. He pinched a trace with his finger, held it up to the light, and then his face drained of color. His voice was low but firm. "Marian, this isn't sugar. Call Tyler, get him to the hospital immediately." I didn't argue. Grant's voice carried the kind of weight that only comes from years of seeing life hang by a thread. My hands trembled as I sealed the lunchbox inside a clear plastic bag. The office chatter had gone silent. The laughter drained from the room. Everyone could feel something was wrong. Grant was already on his phone, speaking with someone at UW Medical Center. His tone was clipped, professional, and urgent. "Possible toxic exposure. Need immediate toxicology screening." He wrote down instructions, pressed the note into my hand, and squeezed my shoulder. "Take it straight there, don't waste a minute." At the hospital reception, I placed the bagged container on the counter. A nurse blinked in surprise, then answered the ringing phone on her desk. I could faintly hear Grant's voice on the line, explaining the urgency. The nurse nodded briskly, called for a lab technician, and within seconds the sample disappeared down the hall. I sat in the waiting room, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air, my pulse hammering. Dr. Priya Shah, a toxicologist, arrived with calm eyes but serious words. "The preliminary test shows arsenic compounds. If your son has been eating from this box, he is in danger." I left the hospital shaken but determined. If arsenic was really in that food, I needed to understand who stood to gain from Tyler's suffering. There was only one place to go: Rachel Porter, my attorney of more than 20 years. Rachel welcomed me into her office, a quiet space lined with books and certificates. She adjusted her glasses as I laid out the situation. Without hesitation, she pulled my estate folder from a cabinet and spread the pages across her desk. The words blurred before my eyes, but Rachel guided me gently. "Here," she said, pointing to a section one had signed last year. "My assets were divided between Tyler and Avery, but if Tyler were to pass away before me, Avery would automatically inherit his share properties, investments, and eventually full control once I was gone." My breath caught. "So even if I'm alive, she benefits?" I asked, my voice trembling. Rachel shook her head. "Not while you're living. But Tyler's death would speed her path to everything." The realization settled like ice in my chest. What once looked like a careless mix-up now cast a terrifying shadow. The will I thought was generous might have become a motive. Driving home from Rachel's office, my thoughts swirled in painful circles. Avery had always been the daughter-in-law I bragged about. She remembered birthdays, sent me little notes, and often insisted I rest while she finished the dishes. Could someone so attentive be capable of slipping poison into a pot? I replayed small moments I had once dismissed. Tyler's glass was always poured first. If I offered to swap plates, Avery would laugh nervously and distract me with a story. At dinner one night, she asked casually about the value of our summer house in Oregon. Another time, she wondered aloud how long it might take me to step back from the perfume studio. At the time, her questions felt harmless, maybe even ambitious. But now, doubt gnawed at me. Was I looking at coincidences through the wrong lens? My heart still wanted to protect her image, to believe in her kindness. Yet my reason whispered that love does not erase evidence. As I parked in front of our house, I stared at the warm light spilling from the windows. I longed for comfort, but instead I felt the fragile ground of trust shifting beneath my feet. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the plastic bag still in my purse. Every instinct in me wanted to confront Avery face to face, to shout and demand answers. But I also knew emotion alone would not protect Tyler. Evidence would. I called Grant first. His voice was calm, steady. "Marion, don't make this a family argument. Make it a case." He connected me with Lieutenant Naomi Briggs, a Seattle police officer he trusted. She specialized in financial crimes and domestic harm situations where betrayal lived under the same roof. Naomi met me the next morning at her precinct office. She listened without interrupting, her eyes sharp but sympathetic. "Here's the truth," she said finally. "You can't accuse her yet. You need to build a timeline, collect samples, document everything. If this is real, we'll prove it. If it isn't, we'll know." She laid out the rules: don't change routines too suddenly, don't confront Avery, and above all, keep Tyler safe. We'll get him medically monitored, but Marion, you need patience. Rage won't win this battle. Process will. I left the precinct holding on to those words. It wasn't the fight I wanted, but it was the only fight that could save my son. Following Naomi's advice, I needed a way to test Avery's intentions without tipping my hand. Rachel helped me stage a conversation in my living room where Avery could overhear. I opened the window a little wider than usual, knowing sound traveled easily down the hall. Rachel and I spoke clearly about a new plan for my estate. I told her I wanted to donate 80% of my assets to a foundation for foster youth, leaving only a small portion to family. Rachel nodded along, playing her role perfectly. As I raised my voice slightly for emphasis, I heard footsteps pause outside the doorway. I didn't look up, but I felt the weight of Avery's attention. My heart pounded, yet I forced a steady smile and kept talking. Later that evening, I noticed Avery at dinner, her fork moving slower than usual. She asked offhand if charity donations could really take effect so quickly. I pretended not to notice the tremor in her voice. That moment confirmed what I feared. Money wasn't just in the background, it was at the center. And Avery had just realized her grip on it might slip away. A few days later, Naomi's team came to the house under the guise of routine maintenance. With practiced efficiency, they installed a tiny wide-angle camera above the pantry doorframe and a microphone tucked near the stove vent. Everything was legal, everything documented. The equipment blended so seamlessly into the kitchen that even I forgot it was there after a while. The plan was simple: observe without interference, no accusations, no dramatic setups. Just watch what entered a pot, how it was stirred, and what ended up on Tyler's plate. The first evening under surveillance, Avery tied on her apron and began cooking soup. I sat nearby with a magazine, pretending not to notice. Through the discreet monitor Naomi had given me, I saw every move in crisp detail. Avery reached for a small amber vial hidden behind the spice jars. She tilted it gently, tapping a fine white powder into the simmering broth. Her face showed no hesitation, only a practiced calm. She stirred, tasted, then wiped the rim of the pot, as though nothing unusual had happened. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have sworn she was simply seasoning dinner. The next morning, I carefully scooped a portion of the soup into a sterile container Naomi had provided. I sealed it, signed the evidence tag, and passed it to her at the precinct. Every detail was logged: time, place, and my initials, so there could be no doubt later. 2 days dragged by before Dr. Priya Shah called. Her voice was steady, but the words felt like ice. The arsenic concentration is higher than in the first sample. If he had eaten more, his condition would have worsened quickly. I gripped the phone, staring at the garden outside my window. My son had been living on meals prepared with poison, and the doses were climbing. Naomi confirmed what I already suspected. Avery had heard the talk about charity and panicked. When greed senses time slipping away, she told me, plans accelerate. That's when mistakes happen. For the first time, I felt both terror and resolve in equal measure. Terror that Avery might act faster than we could stop her. Resolve that I would not allow Tyler's life to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's scheme. Evidence was mounting, and so was the danger. By then, Naomi decided it was time to move from gathering evidence to forcing the truth into the open. The plan was bold but careful. Tyler would stage a collapse at dinner, triggering a medical response already prepared at UW Medical Center. That evening, the table looked ordinary: candles lit, wine glasses half full, Avery moving gracefully between kitchen and dining room. She set a steaming bowl in front of Tyler with a tender smile. "I made this just for you," she said, brushing his shoulder as though she were the most attentive wife in the world. Tyler gave me a brief glance, the signal we had agreed upon. He lifted the spoon, pretended to taste a bit, then set it down. Moments later, he clutched his stomach, his face twisting in pain. With a groan, he collapsed forward, knocking over his water glass. "Tyler," I cried, my voice cracking. It was half-acting, half-real terror watching my son slump motionless in his chair. Avery rushed to his side, calling his name. But I caught the faintest glimmer in her eyes, something that looked less like fear and more like relief. I dialed 911, my words tumbling fast. Within minutes, paramedics, already briefed officers in disguise, arrived, loading Tyler onto a stretcher. Avery reached for his hand, insisting she ride along. But I stepped in firmly. "I'll go," I told her, holding her trembling gaze. The ambulance sped through Seattle's evening traffic, siren wailing above the hum of the city. I sat beside Tyler, who lay perfectly still, his skin pale from carefully applied makeup. My hand covered his, and though I knew this was a performance, my heart still raced with fear. At UW Medical Center, a private room had been prepared. Hidden cameras were fixed in the corners, and the monitors displayed a false pattern of cardiac arrest. Dr. Priya Shah and a trusted nurse hovered nearby, ready to intervene if Avery suspected a trick. I texted her from the hallway, "Come quickly." Tyler didn't make it. My thumb shook as I pressed send. 40 minutes later, hurried footsteps echoed outside. Avery appeared, hair disheveled, one heel crooked, mascara smudged, as if tears had been forced along the drive. She ran to me, hugging me tightly. "It can't be true, Marion. He was too young." I guided her to the bedside where Tyler lay motionless, sheet pulled to his chest. She touched his hand, bent close, and whispered words meant only for him. "Finally, it's over." The hidden microphone caught it all. My breath caught in my throat, and in that instant, Tyler opened his eyes. Avery's scream pierced the room. Lieutenant Briggs stepped into the hospital room with quiet authority, two officers at her side. Avery stumbled backward, her face pale, eyes darting toward the door. "Avery Reed," Briggs said firmly, "you are under arrest for attempted murder." The officers read her rights while I stood frozen, my heart pounding. Avery shook her head furiously. "No, it's not true. You're twisting everything. That powder, it was just vitamins. Tyler's been tired. I only wanted to help him." Briggs laid a folder on the table and slid out a series of photographs. Still images from the hidden camera showed Avery tipping the vial into soup, wiping the rim, and stirring with calculated ease. Another page listed the toxicology reports, each noting arsenic. Avery's voice faltered. "You can't prove intent." Then came the recording. Her own whisper played through a small speaker. "Finally, it's over." The sound hung in the air like a blade. Avery's knees buckled, and she sank into the chair. Her public defender, summoned quickly, urged her to cooperate. For the first time, Avery's tears spilled without performance. But even then, I sensed no remorse, only the terror of being caught. After Avery's arrest, the house felt unbearably quiet. Tyler was discharged a few days later after thorough testing. Dr. Shah assured us his body would recover with time, though the damage from months of exposure would need careful monitoring. I thanked her with tears in my eyes, knowing she had helped save my son's life. At the studio, I gathered my staff and explained I would be stepping back briefly. Grant volunteered to oversee operations, reminding me gently, "Family first, Marion." His words steadied me. The newspapers ran headlines about the case, but we kept our circle small. Neighbors whispered. Friends called with sympathy. Yet I found little comfort in any of it. Grief lingered not for Avery's arrest, but for the love Tyler thought he had, and the family I believed we shared. One evening on the porch, Tyler leaned against the railing, eyes weary. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know how to start over." I put my arm around him. "You already have, because you're still here." In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing everything. Pain like that can crush you or it can shape you. I chose the latter. With Rachel's guidance, I moved forward with the plan I had once staged as a trap. I founded the Cole Foundation, dedicated to supporting women facing financial abuse and coercion. We funded legal clinics, offered small emergency grants, and partnered with shelters that helped families rebuild their lives. At the launch event, I stood at the podium, my voice steady. This foundation was born from betrayal, but it will grow from love. Faces in the audience nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Transforming my grief into action didn't erase the scars, but it gave them meaning. Purpose became the thread that stitched my broken heart back together. Looking back, I often ask myself what signs I missed. Tyler's fatigue, his stomach aches, the strange bitterness in his meals individually, they all seemed harmless. Together, they painted a picture I should have seen sooner. If there's one lesson I can share, it is this: trust your instincts but let evidence lead. Sudden changes in health should never be dismissed. Ask doctors about possible exposures, keep records, and if something feels wrong, speak up. Another truth is simpler: review your paperwork. Wills, powers of attorney, and financial documents aren't just formalities, they can become motives if left unchecked. Protect yourself and your loved ones by keeping them clear and updated. Most of all, remember that love does not blind us, it should guide us to protect one another. Silence never keeps the peace. Only courage does. That is what I wish I had known earlier. As I sit here now, I don't tell this story to make you fearful of those around you. I share it because sometimes the smallest detail, a crystal on the rim of a lunchbox, can carry the loudest warning. I'm grateful every day that Tyler is alive, and that together we chose patience over fury, evidence over suspicion. Love gave me the courage to fight for him, even when the truth broke my heart. If my story steadies your feet today, let it remind you to listen to your instincts and to guard what matters most. Tap like so this reaches someone who needs it. Share it with a friend who always cooks for everyone. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. We'll keep each other brave, because courage shared multiplies.